this one's live. Hi, everybody. I'm David Singer. I do the program here, and we're really happy to have Jenelle Porter here introducing the Indigenous Present, An Indigenous Present. That was edited by Jeffrey Gibson, who is on the screen here, and so happy that he can be with us virtually. And Jenelle, kick it off.
What is this? No. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Jeffrey and I are this is our first talk about this book. So a little housekeeping for you. First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for putting up with me in the physical form and Jeffrey in the virtual form, though we are all used to this at this point. But Jeffrey is in Hudson, New York, where he lives. Actually, he's in Germantown. He's at home today, but there. And we are actually officially launching this book next Saturday in Santa Fe. So this is like a preview of this huge book that we made. We're going to be at the Delmonico Books booth after, if anybody's interested in getting this book while you can. So Jeffrey and I are going to just talk about making this book, which we did over the last 2 years, starting in January of 2021. So Jeffrey, I am going to get you started talking with us about what was the idea for this book? What did you go in thinking that you wanted to do?
Well, first of all, thank you to everyone for being here, and sorry I'm not there in person. But yeah, I guess I've always been a big fan of magazines, and in many ways, growing up like abroad and in the suburbs, sometimes different parts of my life, magazines were kind of how I connected to a larger cultural world. And so as I got older and there was so little representation of Indigenous and Native artists, I started dreaming about a kind of editorial publication that just really featured what I was really attracted to about what contemporary Native artists were making. So I started finally, getting fed up with no one else. I didn't see something out there that I was responding to. And so I decided, I was like, let me just look into seeing what it would be like. And Jenelle and I have known each other since, I think we originally met in 2012 and eventually did an exhibition together in 2013 at the ICA in Boston. And I knew that she knew a lot about making books. So I called her and I just asked her what it would be like to make a publication. And well, actually at that point I had realized what I could probably commit to as a book as opposed to like a quarterly journal or something. And I talked to Jenelle and that was literally 2.5 years ago, and it felt much more easy. I was like, let's make a book. And then, I told Jenelle this earlier today, I didn't actually realize how the way that we made this book was really any different than the way that other people would make a book. I'm still a very much cut and paste kind of person, as is Jenelle. And so, yeah, Jenelle asked me pretty immediately, who are the artists that you would envision in this book? And I rattled off a list of names of about 40 artists at the time. And I thought it was going to be 50. And then as we got deeper into it, it really became about the content of the artwork, the artists, like thinking about different kinds of generations of the book. And eventually at 60, it was sort of where like we could continue this, but at some point we're going to have to draw a boundary of like, let's start making it. And so that's really how we landed at 60. So there's lots of artists who I have a ton of respect for and appreciate their work, but we were not able to include every single artist in this book. And but I'm thrilled with the results. I wanted something that did not use the artist's artwork as like illustrations of academic essays, and I wanted full beautiful images that I do use the word sexy a lot when I want something that I really want other people to enjoy looking at. And I also wanted to use as many Native Indigenous folks as possible in making this book. And so Sebastian Aubin of Otami, who we ended up working with as the designer, is based in Montreal. And we had worked together going back to 2011, I believe was the first time we met. And so that was the beginning, and we slogged it out for 2.5 years, and now we have a beautiful baby.
a very heavy baby.
6-pounder, you know.
But Jeffrey, so we thought we would sort of show you guys kind of like how we made this book and what we did, what was really involved. But Jeffrey, could I get you talking a little bit more about? I'm going to put the artist list on the screen, and it's slightly occluded by your the Zoom link up there. But who are these artists to you? Like, we've been calling it an artist book of artists. Again, you said like kind of had to stop at 60, but there was a sort of a core group that you were thinking about. And could you talk more about why?
Yeah, I think for the most part, you know, the challenges of me identifying as a Native artist during my career, and I would say that really starts right around the year 2000. I mean, education is before that. But I think the challenges, of course, are that people have rarely known how to contextualize my work. They're not familiar with very many Native artists. And so, especially when I was a student, you know, people would bring up Jean Quick-to-See Smith and Edgar Heapabirds, and then they kind of were like, I don't know who else. I don't know where to send you to look. And I know that being an educator, I know this problem still exists today. So that's not a problem that has been resolved over the last 25, 30 years. And so I thought, you know, the thing about, you know, being able to amplify and prioritize Indigenous voices is that in order to understand us, I feel like you also need the context from where we're coming from. So this idea of like 20th century, whether we call it like, you know, pan-Indian, intertribal culture, you know, and heading towards something more specific so that we know that there's a difference between Lakota, there's a difference between Menominee and Cherokee and Choctaw, has been really important to me. And it kind of was like, you know, at some point we have to stop kind of this massive umbrella terminology of Native and Indigenous and get more specific in order to understand who the individuals are. And I would say that the artists in this book, you know, they're doing that with their work. A lot of them are drawing on very culturally specific knowledge, practices, formats, materials. And then, you know, that work that they're making is engaging in larger conversations that are topical as opposed to just being about identity. And I think that that's something that I've always strived to do in my own work. And so, yeah, I just thought, I was like, you know, I don't need to be in this book, but I do want to see a kind of, just like a fluid kind of way to show people how much is going on. I guess the other thing is also that, you know, I mean, I think everybody can agree that the moment that we're in right now, there's more focus on Indigenous artists and what those topics are when you look at that artwork. And I have always wanted the boundaries of what I always refer to as a narrow lane that's offered to Native artists to kind of melt away and let the artists come forward and determine their own boundaries. And I think these artists do that. Some of the artists who are of an older generation and some of them are no longer with us, living with us, they passed on. Their work, unfortunately, during their lifetime did not have a context to kind of move within. And so I would say for many of them, they were not only ahead of their time, but they were also kind of remained not very well known in the larger art world.
Yeah. I know, Jeffrey, that you had you do a lot of collaboration with other artists in terms of inviting people in. And one of the show that you made in 2011, which was where I was introduced to your work, was a show that you did at Participant in New York. I just want to pause and say how weird it is to like be looking at a screen and you guys. I feel so awkward. Thank you for your patience. And Jeffrey can't see you at all, but so trying to make this as conversational as possible, like I'm talking to a screen and your lovely face is right here. So I go to this place in Participant, which is this fantastic nonprofit in Lower Manhattan run by Leah Gangitano, where you always see like the most cutting edge, incredible work. And I did not know Jeffrey's work. I don't think I knew it at all, frankly. And I saw this show at Participant, and I was really blown away. I just moved to Boston. And so Jeffrey and I had actually never met or anything. He was in New York at that point. I had left New York, so we didn't we weren't in the same circles. Saw the show, was like who is this? What is this work? This artist is so interesting. I've never seen anything like that. You know when you walk into a show and you just feel totally different, and you just feel like you just got a new skin, or you shed a skin, or something like that. And I contacted Jeffrey pretty soon after and said, like, I would love to do a studio visit with you. I invited him to make this show. And since then, I've been able to include his work somewhere else. He's asked me to write about his work. But when he called me and said, okay, this is the list of like 30, 40 names I'm thinking about, I quickly said, I don't know most of these artists. I've never heard of them. And I knew like maybe the handful, like the more famous ones, right, Jeff? Like the names that are like slightly, if you're paying attention to contemporary, you probably know them. And so I did homework, and he and I had a bunch more calls, and he asked me if I would help him make the book. So we sort of divided ourselves up labor-wise, which is that it's Jeffrey's concept, it's his idea, it's completely his list of artists. And but we talked a lot about everything we're doing, and because I know how to make books and has made a lot of books during my 25 years as a curator in museums and whatnot, it's like, so I know the nuts and bolts. And I'm also married to a book designer, so I just have like know a lot about making books. So we sort of dived in. We knew we wanted Sebastian Aubin to make our book, and so I'm just going to show you, and we'll keep talking about all of this stuff, like kind of what we did to make this book. So we did studio visits with everybody in the book, starting in around like April or May, Jeffrey, of 2021. And so I just did a little screen grabs, which I have to admit is hard to do, because I was like, wow, we have funny faces in all of these screen grabs. So we talked to every artist in the book. We asked them for an hour. We paid them $250 for their time. Jeffrey would tell them about the book. I went in having done a lot of homework on who this artist was, mostly online, and we talked to them about the work. So straight up virtual studio visit. But we asked them questions about, like, have you ever seen a book like this? What would a book like this mean to you? What kind of ways would you want to be represented in this book? And maybe one more thing I'll say before I'll come back to Jeffrey is that the people included in this book are visual artists, choreographers, filmmakers, poets, writers, musicians, performance artists. It's really expansive, but primarily visual artists, because it's like, we're still kind of the conversation we know more. But Jeffrey, one thing that we talked a lot about when you and I would talk about these calls was like how much we were both learning from all of these artists. You mentioned before about the specifics of somebody's experience, these artists. And, an artist like, so on the top left is a studio visit, slightly cut off, with Eric Paul Riche, who is working in Gallup, New Mexico, and grew up in Gallup. And on the bottom is Deani Whitehawk, who's working near St. Paul, Minnesota. And on the right is Rebecca Belmore, who's in Vancouver and has lived in a lot of places in Canada, actually. Incredible performance artist, absolutely amazing. And on the bottom is a talk with Lakaluk Williamson Bathory, who is Inuit. So she's in like totally the opposite corner of this continent. So Jeffrey, what were some of the maybe experiences you remember of some of these calls that we had, or anything that surprised you or didn't surprise you?
I remember getting really emotional on a number of the calls, I think because there was so much shared struggle for a lot of people in terms of the understanding of their work. And I think the level of commitment that artists in particular, have pursued their vision. That I was already aware because I've shown and exhibited both in Canada and in the US and in other places as well. But I think the difference in particular of the understanding of Indigenous people in Canada versus the US, it was affirmed. It wasn't really any big surprises. I had already known that, Canada has its own issues as well, with Indigenous artists. But it was definitely came across as far ahead, much more progressive than the US. Um, I think, how personal it was. And the other thing that was also affirmed, because I would say I think I knew it before, but that every artist we spoke to is confident that their work is actually on behalf of larger communities, even though the role of a contemporary artist is oftentimes based on the individual. Really, people feel and are doing it on behalf of younger generations of artists, in honor and respect of older generations of artists and of their home communities. It was I don't think anyone we spoke to was like was solely felt solely responsible for their work, in its content and in its aesthetic and its design and its intention, and that was just really powerful. I think that was sort of like, this is the context that I know exists, and what a joy it is to have so many voices that reflect each other and to get to compile them.
Yeah, yeah. I remember that too, that Dana Clacton told us that the U.S. was at least 20 years behind Canada in terms of Indigenous artists, like in academic institutions, showing in museums, staff, and I have to admit that really, it was like when she said it, I knew it was exactly true, and at the same time, it really shocked me, because again, I was on a personal, like very steep learning curve with this sort of ins and outs of those systems. I know it goes on here, but it's funny. It's like Canada is just there, but so far away. It's not somewhere I've traveled a lot, but there's many. I can't think right now just off the top of my head, but there's probably at least 15 of the 60 artists in the book are living and working in Canada. So a couple of the things in terms of like how the sausage got made on this book was that we knew we wanted to try to fund it entirely ourselves so that we could have full like freedom of what we wanted to make. And we, that turned out, like it just turned out much better than we thought, because we got a huge grant from the Mellon Foundation that paid for everything that we wanted to do. And at some point, the book went from an idea that was going to be something like a 250-ish page picture book to my sort of saying to Jeffrey, like, yeah, no, we have to go much, much, much bigger. We have to be bigger than other books, because we kept saying to ourselves, and other people kept saying to us, there's nothing like this. There's no comp. And one of the reasons that there's no comp book is that the conversations that Indigenous artists are responsible for are not just with their work, but with their home communities, as Jeffrey's saying, and with their traditions and histories and customs, etc. And it's just so different than a conversation around a book that you might have that would gather, for example, Black artists into which there are so many books like that. And so we, that was one thing that the book got so much bigger. And another thing that we were trying to do was just do it all different. I mean, it's still a book, right? It's still a book. So you have parameters. It has to be in covers. It's paper. It's pages. We had the great fortune that Delmonico came on as a partner to help us publish this book and get it out into the world. But we're like, okay, now how do we make this? Because we want it to be mostly images. We want the work to come through. We don't want to make one of those like bite-on, like a vitamin I, where it's like a blurb on the artist and then a spread of pictures. We wanted just something solely different. Jeffrey, maybe you would want to speak more to that kind of flow that we were trying to create, or what we wanted to create. And I'll show some pictures of us making it while talking.
Well, first of all, I was never going to not let it be this big. So from day one, this is the size of book that I wanted to be. And there were many conversations about, how this is going to be an expensive book to make. It's going to be an expensive book for people to buy. And I was like, I don't care. I know this book doesn't exist. And I know this is the book that I would have been thrilled to be in as a younger artist. And so that was never, the scale of it was always an absolute for me. Um, and yeah, and to have and I'm somebody who buys books, so I wanted it to be a book that I personally would be excited to buy and to own. And and I think part of it is, again, it goes back to the kinds of books that I have been exposed to about Native artists in the past, which are oftentimes regional, so like arts of the Southwest, arts of the Northeast, arts of, the Southeast. So I think that regionalism was something that and I'm not trying to dismiss its usefulness at all. There's definite validity to thinking about those regions. But for me, it was really to focus on artists who were making work that surpassed all of that. The work surpasses all of that kind of classification. And so also, I didn't want to break it down by, fiber versus painting versus music, and so the visual flow, especially in the conversations with people and realizing about the content of the work. And that was one thing that, Jenelle and I talked about. Jenelle has, 20 plus years and still works as a independent curator, but as an institutional curator. And, I've also, as an artist, I've worked with curators who said to me, well, we have a Choctaw basket, so we thought we would put it next to your painting. I was like, and that's just so completely reductive to just want to focus on the Choctaw and not, it doesn't bring anything out in the basket, and it doesn't bring anything out in my painting. And it doesn't challenge anybody to think about how expansive Choctaw culture is, right? And so for me, I didn't want to do any of that. And I just thought, let's focus on the content and let's let it feel right. I mean, a lot of what you're looking at here in this image, for instance, is all of the printouts that we would lay next to each other. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is just thinking about like what feels right next to each other, and then thinking about the conversations that we had with the artists. And sometimes we're like, no, they would not feel good about that. This piece doesn't belong with that, because remember when they said this, like that belongs somewhere else. So we did have these kind of like, I don't remember the titles. We had some great titles for how like we were thinking
of sections and stuff.
Yeah, for sections, but even then we knew that those sections were not going to be printed. They were there to give us some sort of guidance, but they were pretty out there. I remember some of I loved them. They were like
there was one that was
like
horses
like
and cars or something.
So yeah, there was horses and cars, but it was very intuitive in many ways, and a lot of it had to do with feeling and this flow that I wanted from page 1 to page 450. I didn't want anyone to feel disrupted. Like you should feel almost like you forget about time. You're excited to turn the page and see what's on the next page. And also that you could pick it up and start at page 70 and go to page 90, put it down, come back, start at page 20, go to page 30, put it down, come back. And you're not going to feel like you didn't get the beginning, middle, and end. You're totally like satiated with this bite that you got.
Yeah, I think there's something like 400 images in this book or something. It was really quite a project in here. So this was like our first round with our designer, and we were, as Jeffrey said, just like laying things down and flowing with it. And it was like we were all doing it. We'd sort of move things around, and we're thinking about these categories and like, is this something? Is this not? And then, so that was like round 1. And then the next round was just Jeffrey and I, we'd finally like culled the images down to about 5 per artist. So I had gathered like probably 20 images by each of the people in the book just to kind of work through. And then Jeffrey and I had all these Zoom sessions of like cutting it down and thinking about, again, have a conversation with the artist. They said, oh, that they really would like this picture in the book. We really kept the line of communication with the people in the book very open. And while also trying not to say like, hey, listen, this is not your labor. You don't have to do this. We want you to, but if you just like want to send us these pictures and not be part of this conversation, totally fine too. It was really, I think went pretty smoothly. And then there's of course like, please write us back and send pictures. There's a lot of kind of gentle harassing when you're trying to meet any deadline. So this second round was like Jeffrey and I, so we'd culled it, we made all these little pictures, and then we may or may not have gotten high and like flowed with the images, which was really I would say, I want to say from my perspective as a curator who is used to making books and installing shows of objects. And when you're installing a show, it's something like interior decorating, right? Like it needs to look really good. You think about sight lines, you think about how things go together. And Jeffrey would sort of like push back on me and say like, no, that's not quite right. Like you're getting too curatory. And then I would push on him and be like, this just feels really good to me. And we just really, it was, I think because we were so intimate, Jeffrey, with the material at that point, like we'd talked to all the artists. We'd been reading. We'd been talking to the writers. We haven't even gotten to the writers yet, but the writers in the book, we were talking to them, well, what do you want to write? Like, what would be interesting to you to contribute? And we would tell them all about the book, and they would come back to us, and we got just incredible contributions from writers. Layli Long Soldier wrote an incredible experimental essay, she calls it, about a homework assignment that her child did, and then moves into the 215 bodies that were found at Kamloops school, residential school, and her and her daughter making an artwork about that, to Jarrett Martineau writing about music and the changing field of the last 10 years. So the texts and the images sort of go back and forth and support one another as well, but are, like Jeffrey, you were saying, with these coming back and forth through the images, the texts are also totally like standalone. And you can dip in anywhere in this book and read one of those essays. But the only structure to it is like a long image sequence, a text, a long image sequence, a text. It's sort of what we did, just like real book pacing. And then this became like, we took all these little pictures off the wall, and this is primarily what the book became. Like, this is what you see in these pages of this book. And I've sort of scrolled through some more of these pages of the book that you get just relationships to us that were, as Jeffrey, you said, like feels. Like, this is all feels, but it's also totally informed by the conversations that we had with people. Maybe one thing.
Yeah, and I think it was also surprising because there were.
You go.
I was just going to say it was surprising. It was surprising because there were images that, like, you think they would go together, but in the process of this was a surprise for me that these two images landed next to each other, and that I feel like they really speak to each other. I guess it was much more like curating artworks in the sense that, for me at least, when I think about like just organizing a show of my own, it's like I want the works to be in dialogue with each other, but I also want them to kind of like wake each other up in ways that they wouldn't if they weren't right next to each other, Yeah. And so it was, it was actually a lot of fun. It was exhausting, but it was fun.
We have these, I actually can't move the screen over, you guys, I'm sorry, but this is, you'll see, you can take a look at the book. We also have this idea of like commercial breaks in the book, that we have these commercial breaks with this collective called New Red Order. They're absolutely incredible. They make such good work, very using parody and satire. And this is like, the ads, it's like an ad that they made for a magazine that they did, and it says like, are you ready to give your land back? Like how to turn your home into a tipi. And it's just like, it's so funny, but it's that kind of funny where you're just like, oh God, like, yeah, that it just, their work is so effective. And these are some of the contributions, but maybe before we see if anybody has any questions, couple of things that I'm thinking, Jeffrey, that we could add that we didn't, which is one, we recorded all the conversations that we had with artists and want to find an archive for them. And another thing that was like from first conversation that we had, this is the back cover by Dylan McLaughlin, it was that we know the book is going to be expensive. Jeffrey had said we want this book to be in the hands of like the teenagers that we would want to see this book, like the book that Jeffrey wanted to have when he was a teenager. So part of like making the book was that we were going to get 1,000 copies, like the way publishing works is like you have your contribution and you get books in return. And we are donating most of those to home communities that we identify through asking the artists. Like we said to all the artists, okay, we want to give you 5 books. We're going to mail you 1. And then please give us the name of 4 places that you would want us to give the book to. And the list is so incredible because we would have never maybe found all these people. And this can range from someone's high school art teacher to a prison in their town. And it's just sort of, so that is like 4 books times 60. So that's already 240. And we've also identified it. And we'll just keep gathering names and sending books as we can. And we're just paying for that and funding it. And like, here's the book. We'll send a letter that said, this artist wanted you to have this. And that is like that's just been a big dream, right, Jeff, to like give this book for free to communities.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's totally grassroots.
Yeah.
We're just doing it in the most grassroots way. Like, and we're already learning that it's going to take us a long time to send all these books. Like, there's nobody in Jeffrey's studio that it just has enough to. It's not making like a painting or beating something or working to make artwork. So we're actually still figuring out how to get all the books out to people. It's going to take us some time. We're taking volunteers. Anybody in the Hudson area? So I'm looking at my clock. Jeffrey, is there anything you want to add before we ask for questions from people, or just turn it into a discussion?
I will just say we did actually, we received some donations of people who were interested in supporting what I've called the Equitable Distribution Plan. So we did receive money ultimately from Bennett and Julie Roberts of Roberts Projects and also from Forge Project. Mm-hmm. And that was great, because I think I've fallen in love all over again with the independent spirit of being a creative person. And, I am so thankful that the way this book was made was really, we did not compromise. There's no compromise in this book. And I think that the distribution of those books is so important. And that list of those organizations is so important and is such a community document. There's no way that one person would know how to put that list together as an individual.
Yeah.
So that is a really special thing.
Yeah, it's so true. Okay, audience, I know Jeffrey can't see you, and that's a little funky, but does anybody want to add anything, ask anything, know anything? I know we said a lot, so I'll open it to you. Yes, please.
I'm curious about the title, Indigenous Present.
Uh-huh.
And just, it's a pretty open question, but just unpacking that, what that, over the course of these 2.5 years,
Yeah.
ended up meaning for you at this point in the publication.
Okay, I'm going to repeat that for Jeff. So the question is about the title of the book and sort of unpacking that title, those words, as we worked on the book over the last couple of years.
And the present, is it
Yeah.
Is it to attempt to capture the present now? Or is it like a...
Okay, and is it to capture the present now or something? Jeffrey, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I don't remember exactly when we landed on that title. I know it was hovering around as a working title, and then we all agreed that it made perfect sense. But I do remember early on in the book when we were talking about, well, like, what is this book? And I would say I have never seen this much attention being paid to Native and Indigenous artists in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And I would say arguably maybe ever, as far as I know. But so I was like, this is a snapshot to document this moment. And so in terms of time, for me, it really was about the now, right? This is really a snapshot of now. And, we talked about, well, I hope what this book will do is provide one model of how somebody else might make a book, and Jenelle and I talked about this, about how do we draw the line at how many artists we include, because we were like, well, since we've been working on this book, we could add easily 25 more artists to this list that I didn't know about. And So I feel like there's a future there, and I mean, time was one of those topics that I know I've thought about during making this book, but also I think most artists at some point talked about time, and they might talk about that in terms of their family and intergenerational narratives or storytelling or how oral history is passed down, how knowledge is passed down. But time was a real big point um, throughout the process. And then, of course, like, the kind of secondary meaning of like a gift, and I think that was not with me originally, but um, I like it. It just didn't originate with me. And that's, but I know that a lot of people feel that as well, that it's an Indigenous present.
There's a couple, there was one moment that I remember, which is that Jeffrey and I were talking, and he was telling me about a panel he had just been on, and that the composer and musician Raven Chacon, who's included in the book, he'd been on this panel with Raven and a couple other artists, and they were all talking, and I think that there had been some audience question about futurism, which is, of course, such like a key motif and subject for so many artists of color, communities of color, like, because the past has been so fraught and the present is not so great. So it's all about like building a better future. But so many of like the books, it's become like a little bit of a buzzword. I think we were sort of feeling like that wasn't where we were going necessarily, but that Raven at some point had shared like that somebody asked him about futurism, and he had said something along the lines of, "I'm just trying to work in the present." And I remember Jeffrey telling me this story and just kind of saying it back to him, like An Indigenous Present, like that we were just, and then it just felt exactly good. And so we were using it for a while, and there was never really any other, and the play on words was so important. I mean, Jeffrey said from first call, which is like, I just want to make something about what's happening to give back. And, but I think that what Jeffrey's saying about time, it's so interesting, is it really did come up so much, and there were so many, that time is a concept that can apply to a lot of the subjects in the artist's work in the book, like landscape and performance and sovereignty and materiality. There was so much talking about like making and materiality. But we love the title. It really just was like that title. Coming up with a title for a book or an artwork can be so hard, and we were just like, oh yeah, that's it. That it really felt. I mean, maybe we let it sit for a while, but it never went away, and it felt just so perfect. And it looks good. And Caroline Monet, one of the artists in the book, she made this cover for us without us even kind of like, I mean, it was a little bit of a funny story, but this cover just kind of came, and like there was never a better cover. There were so many things in this project that's kind of manifested out, like who ended up working on the book and how things happened, and it was a very big, hard project. And we even were intended to put it out like even a year before we did, but it was like it just couldn't be done. And then we feel like it kind of came out at the exact right time. Jeffrey keeps saying like, but it's the exact right time. It's coming out at the exact right time. Does anybody else want to ask? Yes. Oh, that's a great question. So Jeffrey, the question is, given what you were thinking about initially, which was like a magazine, a journal, something that there was a lot of and was ongoing, how did we then get to a decision of like a big, sexy, hardcover art book? Jeffrey can answer that, I think, very clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I realized about the editorial, the kind of what I was thinking of as a quarterly journal, it's just not anything that I can commit to. It's very much like it's a time and commitment thing about what I can do. And, I feel like a lot of the intentions of this book, I also try to practice in my own artistic practice. And, one of the things that comes up in publishing, which was new to me, was like, well, publishing is really challenging. There's no money to be made in publishing. And I kept telling Jenelle, and Jenelle was on board with this. I was like, look, I'm not in this to make money. We're going to have to think about this more like an art project. And the art project has goals. So I was able to treat it that way, as like, not that this is an artwork, but I could kind of apply that structure the way that I kind of chase an artwork in producing this book. And the parallels of collaboration, of invitation, of other people contributing to, very much mirrors a lot of what happens in primarily performance and video work that I do. And so for that, but otherwise, the thing about a journal was just how much time it would take. I was like, oh, that's a full-time job. Like, if I really want to pursue this, I'll be doing this. And I think it would be difficult to put down. If you get something going successfully, it would be really difficult to put it down. And I really do enjoy what I get to do as an artist, as an individual artist. So I wasn't looking to become, a publisher of any kind, or a bookmaker or an editor.
But also I think that part of the reason that this became a big book, like when Jeffrey decided like that would be impossible for me to become a publisher, is that it's a little competitive. Like we see what's out there, and there's nothing like this on Indigenous artists. So that's why we were talking about free books too, the equitable distribution plan, like right off the bat, because we thought maybe the book might be like $100 or $125. In fact, it's $75. It's a very fair art book price. And we wanted to make a coffee table book. We're thinking, okay, this isn't just for kids, actually, if we're being frank. This is also for art collectors, the contemporary art hypermarket that we are existing in. Like the people, and we have seen in just the 2 years of working on this book, the exposure that Indigenous artists are having in the market is like, it's really like this on a graph. And there are a lot of collectors that are really going after it. And the prices have risen a lot. And so, okay, well, if you want to know something, like if Jeffrey can, or another artist in the books can say like, hey, if you want to know something about what's going on in this conversation, here's your book. Just start here and then call me. It's just like one idea. But that also, Jeffrey and I are both the same age. We actually turned 50 when we were working on this book. Sorry, I didn't tell them your age. And there's a little bit, too, of, like, that's kind of a milestone. And you start thinking about, like, handing off stuff, right? So, like, Jeffrey has put in so much labor, emotional and, like, educational labor of teaching people and sharing with curators, like, okay, here's what you need to know, right? And, again, it's sort of saying, look, I'm not going to do that anymore. I've done it enough. I want to make art. I mean, I think what's funny about one thing about this book that we've been learning is that, like, this is actually maybe further entrenched Jeffrey in this conversation, but the conversation is changing so much. But yeah, we were like, put this on your coffee table, art collector, and have this be next to all the giant books on like Buck and Jeff Koons and, et cetera. Like that, we want it there too. So that's my version of the. I think maybe like we have time for another question if anybody wants to add anything. Yeah, David.
When you're playing with images and like thinking like it was like a curatorial process, was there any temptation that becomes a template for an actual exhibition?
Yeah. Okay, so did.
Or could you even trust an institution to do?
Okay, two-parter. Very good question. So Jeffrey, David, our host, just asked if there, as we were working on everything, if there was ever a temptation to make an exhibition, and if there's even an institution that one could do it in. It's like, did you say trustworthy? Trustworthy enough to do it in. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the great thing about pursuing a book is you're working with images, so you don't have to take on, scale and size, like space and venue and things like that. And so you have a lot more control. I think we did talk so many times about like what an amazing exhibition this would be.
Mm-hmm.
We also talked about how expensive that exhibition would be to put
How
together.
impossible it might be.
And but we have certainly talked about it. I mean, both Janelle and I, as an artist, and Janelle as a curator, there's plenty of reason to be excited about what it would be like to imagine this in an exhibition space. I do think, you know, I think this book we were able to maintain so much control, and I would imagine in an exhibition that might be more challenging to maintain that level of control. That might be hard for me. Not that I wouldn't think it was worth it. I think if all the circumstances were right, I would consider it for sure. But I didn't have to compromise in this book, and I think I wouldn't want to compromise in an exhibition.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Mary just added that a book is an ideal exhibition, and we did talk a lot about being as an exhibition in a book. But I can add as an institutionalized girl, institutionalized curator person, that I got asked a lot when I would tell fellow colleagues, past and present, that was working on this project, is there going to be a show? Like a lot of excitement. And could there be a show? And could we think about talking to you about this show? And it brought up like a lot more conversations that Jeffrey and I had about who does this show, where would it be, when would it be, what kind of pushback would you get from artists who are tired of being categorized by their identity. That came up when we were working on this book even, that they're not, not everybody who's Indigenous wants to be in a book like this. And you could talk about that in terms of a lot of things. Like I've done a lot of medium-specific shows and had artists be like, I don't want to be in that show. I am not that. I'm not a fiber artist, or like I'm not a ceramist. Like, and that is a completely understandable point of view. But I think that what Jeffrey is saying is really sort of more like where we were going, which is that exhibitions and museums can be scary. And this is something anybody can hold in their, ostensibly anybody, right? In theory. Anybody can hold in their living room and spend time with this in really intimate setting. And there's no threat in a book like this. There's no like going up a big flight of stairs and paying $25 and like being in an institutional space that has institutional demands, that's funded by the ultra wealthy class of collectors and power brokers in our country. But like Jeffrey says, like I'm still wondering, like, is there a place and what would it look like? And I mean, I think there's a great kind of example of something like this on view now at the Hessel Museum at Bard, if anybody gets that way very soon. I don't think the show's traveling, which is a shame. I'm actually not sure why, so I don't want to be too judgy about it. But it's a show called Indian Theater, curated by Candace Hopkins, and it is all Indigenous artists. Jeffrey's work is included. It's incredible, incredible show. And it sort of starts to do, and it's very smart because it themes this exhibition around a certain moment of great, great change and education for Indigenous artists at IAIA in Santa Fe, and around modes of theater and presentation and things like that. So like I'm kind of still hoping, David, like in a way that Jeffrey, when Jeffrey is slightly less busy, which I never see happening, that he and I might, that there's been asks like that we maybe could curate something, or he would curate something, or something along those lines, because there is so much work to be done.
Yeah.
I think we're going to wrap this, but Jeffrey, yes. What are you going to say?
I just want to say there also are a lot of crossover artists between Indian theater and this book, which happened really independently. I mean, excuse me. Candace Hopkins is, a good friend and a colleague, and has organized my work into shows over. In fact, it's Candace is the reason why I met Sebastian Ben in 2011.
The designer.
So I think we were probably, and Candace is one of the contributors. There's an interview between Candace and myself, which I think is a great interview. So I think it's sort of maybe a generational kind of mindset of what needed to happen, what, somebody like Candace or somebody like myself felt was missing and needed to happen. And so I think when I think about exhibitions, I don't think it's about the sprawling group exhibition. I think it's I think in exhibition form, what I would love to do is dive in deeper into some of the ideas that show up in the work collectively and try to put together the most engaging work. And maybe that's only like 2 or 3 artists, you know. I think it's about 60 when it comes to physical space.
Yeah.
Um, and really like let those spaces challenge the artists and create something really really engaging.
And what I would like is for a museum to just give us a gallery for 3 years and just do a series of exhibitions or, you know, forever. Like, okay, Whitney Museum, like, we'll take this area of the floor and we will, are you raising your hand or stretching? Okay. We'll take this area of the floor and we'll just keep going, you know? But then I think it's also interesting to think about, well, should it be in a big commercial gallery? Because these galleries are as big as museums now, and they have a ton of money and they seem to be able to do whatever they want. Can you tell how I feel about them? And like maybe that's a freer space. Like maybe if you're just blatant about like it's the market, it's a market space, and there isn't the baggage. There's a, you know, hyper-capitalism baggage, but that's not different than a museum. So I think it'll be fun to keep talking to Jeffrey about it and some of the other artists. And I think we're going to see a lot more shows happening, frankly, really, that are probably in the hopper. So thank you all so much for coming and listening to our first talk on An Indigenous Present.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mary Delmonico, and everybody. Yeah, and David, thank you for inviting us. Great. Okay, Jeffrey, it was nice to see your sweet face.
All right. Thank you all so much.